So welcome all. I'm Dr. Elvis Imafidon. I work at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where I teach comparative philosophy, particularly comparative African philosophy. And my areas of interest include the African philosophy of disability and the African philosophy of difference. I'm at home in Surrey in England. I have a 3-year-old pretending to be asleep somewhere. And so if she pops up on the screen, please bear with me. And I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa Spitoske. I hope I pronounced that right. Mm-hmm. She publishes in the field of comparative genocide studies, aesthetics, and philosophy of race. Her current project, Hip Hop Testimony and a Critical Aesthetics of Trauma Theory, develops the practical application of analysis about the relationship between hip hop aesthetics and traumatic experience. And this is detailed in her recent book, Hip Hop as Philosophical Text and Testimony. Can I Get a Witness? Where we can find detailed theoretical and clinical approaches to post-traumatic stress disorder. And the book is published just last year, 2020, by Lexington Books in the series on philosophy of race. She will be sharing some fascinating and interesting aspects of her project on hip hop and trauma with us at this time in her talk. And her talk is titled, as you can see already on the screen, Hip Hop Testimony and a Critical Aesthetics of Trauma Theory. After the talk, we'll have the opportunity to ask her a few questions, and you can as well put your question on the chat box, I think. Yeah. So Lisa, you have our attention.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here. As always, eternally grateful to Shelley Tremaine, the tremendous work she's done to allow us all to be here, for this conference to be here, and for her emotional and professional support. In an interview with Tad Friend for The New Yorker about his critically acclaimed and Emmy award-winning TV show, Atlanta, the writer, director, actor, comedian, and underground rapper, Donald Glover, stated that, quote, "People come to Atlanta," and here he means the TV show, "people come to Atlanta for the strip clubs and the music and the cool talking. But the eat your vegetables part is that the characters aren't smoking weed all the time because it's cool, but because they have PTSD. Every Black person does." Glover's view that all Black people suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder is not based on statistics, but instead on a view of trauma that does not regard it as an individual pathology or as a set of pathological symptoms, but rather as the distinct type of harm suffered from a genocidal arrangement of social, political, and economic relations. The sensibility of traumatic violence as a social pathology of white supremacy, as opposed to a mental injury or disorder suffered by an individual, is also reflected in underground hip hop music, as hip hop artists co-opt the term trauma from its use in academic and clinical discourse and re-signify the term as a psychosocial space inflicted and sustained by patterns of state violence against Black communities as such. This is an insight from hip hop culture that I explore in my recent book on hip hop as philosophical text and testimony, in which I argue that underground hip hop music in the United States has always served as an aesthetic depiction of the historical repetition of traumas that are both obscured and deferred by our national narratives. In my text, I draw on underground hip hop identified as music that, as opposed to commercial hip hop, is bigger than hip hop, or motivated by the need to bear witness to and resist the infliction of anti-Black violence in every social and political institution in the United States. Bearing witness to anti-Black violence is the sacred duty of Hip Hop Nation, because the systemic nature of this violence is obfuscated, normalized, and disavowed in the media, political discourse, and educational system. So we can see this very view of underground hip hop that I've just laid out in two images that are actually connected with this iconic phrase, "It's bigger than hip hop," which I cite as sort of the motto for what it means to be underground as opposed to commercial. And the phrase "is bigger than hip hop" as an iconic phrase was introduced by Dead Prez in their single, "It's Bigger Than Hip Hop." And if you think about the artwork first for the original vinyl single, "It's Bigger Than Hip Hop," you see that it references the chains that enslaved African Americans. But then if you look at the album cover for Let's Get Free, oh, and that single, "It's Bigger Than Hip Hop," with that vinyl, that was released as a single by Dead Prez on December 7th, 1999. Right, so a year later, they dropped their debut studio album, Let's Get Free, still iconic, one of the greatest underground albums of all time. That was released on February 8th, 2000, in which Bigger Than Hip Hop appears as a track. It actually appears as a remix of the original song produced by Kanye West. So if that first image references slave chains, that second one, as you can see, references resistance and Black liberation struggles. So if you think about these two images connected just with that track, "It's Bigger Than Hip Hop," if you hold the images together, you also get a good sense of the ethos of underground hip hop, motivated by the need to testify to past traumas for the sake of Black liberation struggles in the present. Also, this phrase "is bigger than hip hop" is so important as like a chant and a motto that I thought I would just play like a minute of it so you can get a sense of what that phrase means to people in Hip Hop Nation.
One thing about music, when it hit, you feel no pain. White folks that controls your brain. I know better than that. That's game, man. We ready for that. Two soldiers head of the pack. Matter of fact, who got the gat and where my army at? Rather attack and not react. Back to beats, it don't reflect on how many records get sold on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Whether your projects put on hold in the real world. These just people with ideas. They just like me and you when the smoke and cameras disappear again. The real world.
A major point about underground hip hop that I defend throughout my book is that insofar as underground hip hop culture in the United States has always served to contest neoliberal and post-racial narratives about American anti-Black racism through the disruption and co-option of melodies, beats, and lyrics, as well as through phenomenological accounts of the lived experience of African Americans, it has always served as a type of subjugated knowledge in the Foucauldian sense that exposes and opposes the totalizing hold of the episteme on our sensibility and thought. In my analysis of the form of hip hop music, not the content, not the lyrics, or in my analysis of the sonic experience of sampling and scratching, I also argue that the aesthetic parallel between hip hop and trauma helps explain the therapeutic value of hip hop and the distinct way it can affect our sensibility. So now I'm going to really quickly review the two distinct aesthetic features of hip hop music for those who are unfamiliar with it. So first we have the art of sampling. James Peterson has referred to the art of sampling as repetition with a signifying difference. Trisha Rose has a great definition. She calls it ideological insubordination. The art of sampling makes use of beats. Oops. The art of sampling makes use of, I just realized I can't, I need to collapse this. There we go. The art of sampling makes use of beats and lyrics from previous recordings in every genre of music in order to reconfigure the mood and or message of the original song. This is the aesthetic form distinct to hip hop that also gives it so much political power. For example, when a song about police brutality is set against beats from a song with a naive, optimistic message, then the rap serves to contest the truth of the original message, which nevertheless serves as the narrative background for the violence that it cannot explain or recognize as an integral part of American life. And two of my favorite examples of sampling that I talk a lot about in the book that illustrate one point that I make about hip hop, insofar as hip hop is always exposing that we tend to read, see, and interpret forms of traumatic violence as forms of tragic violence or sort of accidental and occasional. So two examples that really sort of expose this problem is how Tupac samples Bruce Hornsby's song, The Way It Is, which is a very white conception of like racism, like very tragic. He samples that beat and it's very recognizable to a lot of us for his brilliant song changes. Oh, sorry. And then what Jay-Z does by sampling Annie, It's a Hard Knock Life, for his very brilliant song, Hard Knock Life, in case you want two sort of good examples of that. And next, we have what's called hip hop nation language. Because it operates as a subjugated knowledge, academics view hip hop nation language, a term coined by the sociolinguist H. Sami Alim, as outside the parameters of professional interest, as a naive and philosophically inferior form of discourse, despite its sophisticated construction and multi-layered meaning. Alim establishes the parameters for a study of hip hop linguistics as a variant of the recently codified field of Black linguistics, for it shares the mission of, quote, decolonizing Black language and thought. Sorry, I gotta move this little thing around so I can read. Okay, quote, the central focus of hip hop linguistics is language and language use within hip hop communities. Since language ain't never neutral, hip hop linguistics interrogates the development of unequal power relations between and within groups. There is a reason why hip hop communities resist others' attempts to control their language varieties. You can slap all the explicit lyric stickers you want. Hip hop heads know that policing language is a form of social control that amounts to nothing less than policing people. So hip hop nation language, which informs all hip hop verse in the underground, is animated by the need to oppose the discursive violence of the dominant discourse in order to oppose the oppressive relations of power that it sanctions and obfuscates. The editor of my book is George Yancey, and he, in 2011, co-edited a great book with Susan Hadley called Therapeutic Uses of Rap and Hip Hop. And most of the essays are by psychologists or people who work in psychoanalysis. And that's one of the main points they use over and over again. It's just how therapeutic the language is for people who are oppressed by the dominant discourse. But taking this notion of how hip hop is therapeutic a bit further, my book illustrates an aesthetic connection between the form of hip hop and the form of traumatic experience. So the language of hip hop and the form of hip hop based on sampling and the scratch. So the form of hip hop as music is, we can think of it sampling and the scratch, are based on the interruption, co-option, distortion, and re-signification of words, beats, and melodies, and so provide an aesthetics that is conducive to the expression of traumatic experience. And one way that I tend to think about traumatic experience is that it's the interruption of the present by the violence in the past that one can neither master or understand through its discursive representation. Underground hip hop presents aesthetic depictions of the traumatic violence suffered from anti-Black genocide in order to counter the tragic depiction of Black life central to the post-racial sensibility that supports white ignorance and indifference to the suffering of Black communities. For these reasons, hip hop offers important lessons for the field of trauma theory. For one of the most perplexing questions raised by trauma theorists is how, or if, it is possible to communicate or describe traumatic experiences that are distinguished by the impossibility of knowing or mediating them through abstract categories and ideal narratives about human experience. Although trauma theorists have identified the historical dimension of PTSD, such that the inability to bear witness to the violence suffered in the past leads to the repetition of pathological symptoms in the present, they have not explicitly associated the historical repetition of trauma with systems of oppression against racialized and gendered minorities. Instead, studies in the field tend to focus on individuals who suffer from symptoms of a mental disorder provoked by a type of violence that is only contingently associated with the racist and heterosexist organization of socio-political and economic relations that sustains white supremacy over capital and power. When I had the opportunity to bring this point up with Kathy Carruth, who basically invented the field of trauma theory, when I had the opportunity to bring this point up with Kathy Carruth at a symposium on trauma at DePaul University in 2016, she explained that trauma theorists were wary of making a direct connection between PTSD and systems of oppression due to the fact that it is not the case that every person who suffers from racist or sexist violence will develop PTSD. While this is certainly true, it does not take into account the relation between the individual's symptoms of PTSD and the larger environment that causes it, or the relation between the mental well-being of individuals and the conditions under which their entire community lives. In contrast, hip-hop artists draw attention to trauma as a psychosocial space, inflicted and sustained by patterns of state violence against racialized communities. These patterns of violence are not seen or understood as violent by white sensibility. Underground rappers illustrate that the historical repetition of trauma does not simply occur on the individual psychic level, but instead reveals the pathological economy of American history itself and the trauma of systemic genocidal anti-Black violence that recurs through its disappearance in thought, perception, discourse, and collective understanding about race in American society. If people are unfamiliar with underground hip hop, then they most likely don't know that there are hundreds of rap songs explicitly about trauma and explicitly about post-traumatic stress disorder. There are actually probably thousands because the underground is so vast. It's like impossible to know, but it's a very common recurrent theme in actual hip hop songs. And in every hip hop song I've ever heard devoted to PTSD or trauma, the MC spits bars that connect his PTSD to everyday conditions of violence suffered from being Black in the United States. This is really important to my project, just how frequently rappers are writing songs about it. And so as an example, I'm going to play the recent track just called PTSD, featuring Lil Uzi Vert, Chance the Rapper, Juice WRLD, rest in peace, and G Herbo. This track was released on the 2020 album, which was also called PTSD. The entire album was called PTSD, and the art for that album was the first frame of this PowerPoint. And it really illustrates everything I was just saying about the different way that rappers use the term PTSD. It's very helpful that this is a lyric video, so you can like read the words as you're hearing them.
Like Chief Keef, always yelling names, that's DC's. I go off my mind and my instinct. Shooting at the same time, we was in sync. On the same thing, trying to repeat. We was in the whips, right back on the enemy. Stuffed on my last hit, I was in the middle seat. Fuck it out the sunroof, Brody got a quick release. And we in the car real fast with police. Shots fired back, but it's ass in the street. When I bought a 40 show, Brittany and Tiffany, knowing that they call it shit they can't get from me. A lot of warfare, 17 had a 50 P's. Like store niggas, so you know they want killer G. Royalty, posted in the hood with some Billy Keys. Loyalty, rock dash, show them what it really means. I can't sleep cause it's a war zone in my head. My killer's good, they know I'm hands-on with the bread. $1 million ahead, I'm still angry, seeing red. How the fuck I'm supposed to have fun? All my niggas dead. I turn the news on when I smell death in the air. Prove you wrong, I made it out of here. I don't belong, I see my past everywhere. Don't stand too close to me. Eternal PTSD. I got a war zone inside of my head. I made it on my own. They said I'd be in jail or dead. I see my brothers fall over and over again. Don't stand too close to me. I got PTSD. Used to run home from the train stop. Running so fast, dodging raindrops. Remember got robbed at the park once. Remember thinking that bitch probably ain't caught. Remember I was with my mama one time. Seen a nigga through the glass, hit a nigga with a bank shot. Point blank head hanging off his tank top. Walked up, we drove off, went to game. Stop. Quiet right there, picked up San Andreas. Certain things we ain't talk about, mama, we just prayed up. We seen it all, don't get involved. Carry the weight of the world like a shark. Conceal it, reveal it, if people in cars. I still can feel it, I know that the world is evil in case you thought a nigga forgot it. When my homie was bleeding out, another homie went in his pockets. Please do not run up on me, not even his fans. Niggas get fanned down on the den. Ryan, I'm flying, I'm scary as hell. I need me a Zan. Days seem longer as life gets shorter. We know sex, drugs, money, all in that order. Ain't no structure, no peace. We lost our order, leaving me with anxiety. Fucking lost sobriety.
It's a war zone laying inside my head. I still think about all my niggas that's dead. I'm too paranoid, yeah, I know you heard what I said. I'm too paranoid, I make sure all my eyes stay black. Draining all my energy, no, I cannot speak. I'm affected by streets, no appetite, I can't eat. I only see red when I see. I think it's my PTSD. I think it's my PTSD. I think it's my PTSD. Yeah.
I turn the news on when I smell death in the air.
So yeah, I think you can see it's just so unbelievably powerful. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to get out of here now. Great. So songs like that are also very therapeutic for me and for a lot of people who suffer from PTSD. And I think that they function as a form of EMDR, which is also a big point that I make in my book. So how? Well, the aesthetic parallel between hip hop and trauma helps explain the therapeutic value of hip hop and the distinct way it can affect our sensibility. The testimony in hip hop serves as an aesthetic practice that combines intellectual with sensory stimuli for the sake of recollecting individual and collective traumas in the past, in order to reenact and re-signify them from the subject position in the present of someone who survived them. This aligns with the clinical practice of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, that also works through the combination of intellectual and sensory stimuli to create a form of recollection that leads to an entirely new orientation about how and why one suffered from past traumas. This re-signification of the past allows for greater control over one's symptoms of PTSD in the present. As I say in my book, my point is not that hip hop can cure PTSD, but rather presents a distinct form of traumatic testimony that disrupts those professional and academic discourses about trauma and violence that actually misrepresent traumatic as tragic violence and preclude our recovery as individuals and as a nation. So really quickly, I'm going to better explain my project of a critical aesthetics of trauma theory. Our sensibility does not only refer to what we consciously sense, but to the general framework that makes sensing the world around us possible in the way that we do. Many critical race theorists identify the contours of white neoliberal sensibility as sustaining an insensitivity to Black suffering that is supported by seeing and reading the facts in a way that minimizes the harm and extent of anti-Black violence in the past and present. A critical aesthetics of trauma theory examines how dominant academic and clinical discourses about PTSD predispose us to imagine and conceive of it in a way that aligns with and reproduces the white sensibility of our socio-political reality. So this particular project aims to develop my preliminary insights in the book about the depiction of traumatic violence in the content and form of underground hip hop in order to explore the epistemic, political, and therapeutic importance of this depiction for critical aesthetics of trauma theory and a new approach to the clinical treatment of PTSD. This critical perspective on how trauma theorists and therapists tend to imagine people who suffer from PTSD is made possible by examining how the aesthetic representation of PTSD in hip hop culture departs from the academic and clinical discourse about trauma in three significant ways. First, departing from the clinical discourse about PTSD that views it as an individual pathology, underground hip hop depicts trauma as a social pathology and the symptoms of PTSD as indicating the inability to adapt to a pathological arrangement of socio-political conditions. Two, departing from the current trend in trauma theory to identify the source and cure for PTSD in the behavior of non-human animals. Underground hip hop emphasizes that we suffer from PTSD due to the unnatural, violent, and morally obscene conditions that sustain white supremacy over capital and power. Three, departing from the clinical and theoretical emphasis on the singular, occasional nature of traumatic violations, hip hop artists illustrate that the way in which we talk about repetitive patterns of traumatic violence as singular, occasional, and/or accidental emerges from and reproduces our post-racial sensibility that post-racializes anti-Black violence in the present as a tragic exception to the norm of a just justice system. This disarticulation of traumatic violations as tragic accidents serves to perpetually defer the systemic institutional violence that is the source of generational trauma. So in sum, the clinical sensibility of PTSD as an individual pathology serves to depoliticize the cause of traumatic harms produced by patterns of regular administrative, and entirely preventable forms of state-sanctioned violence that undermine the social vitality of entire communities, whether or not every individual in the community suffers from the symptoms of PTSD. And I do follow the definition of genocide first introduced by Claudia Card, that understands it not in terms of the intentions of the perpetrator, but in terms of the type of harm inflicted, defined as undermining the social vitality of an entire community. Also, to say a little bit more about what I mean, or what hip hop artists mean by signifying trauma and PTSD as a psychosocial space, we don't exist apart from our relationships to those on whom we depend for sustenance and support. Trauma isn't something suffered by an atomic essential self, but a social and political condition that degrades the quality of those relationships that ought to sustain us and undermines the social vitality of an entire community. In this sense, I don't suffer from PTSD because I suffered through multiple occasions of violence. Instead, my symptoms act as a register of the violence systematically inflicted on women to degrade our health and opportunities as a group. And certainly in the song I played for you, you get that sense that the musician doesn't suffer from PTSD because he survived, right, multiple occasions of violence. Instead, the symptoms of every MC who's on that track acts as a register of the violence systematically inflicted on African Americans. We can think about trauma as a psychosocial space occupied by communities who are more vulnerable to PTSD given their unnatural vulnerability to state violence. Shifting the focus from trauma as an individual pathology to a psychosocial space helps us better understand trauma as a product of contingent and unnatural social conditions to which no one should be subject. So the depiction of trauma in the testimony of underground hip hop artists can serve as the basis for a critical aesthetics of trauma theory that examines how certain academic and clinical discourses about PTSD serve to disarticulate the nature of traumatic violations in such a way that, one, reinforces our post-racial sensibility of anti-Black violence in the American present, and two, actually compromises clinical efforts to provide therapy to those who suffer from PTSD. Drawing on these testimonies to lay the basis for a critical aesthetics of trauma theory has several theoretical and clinical implications for the study and treatment of PTSD. First, this critical aesthetics of trauma implies that we need to re-examine how the popular analogy between the human and non-human experience of violence has served to naturalize and depoliticize the infliction of state violence against racialized and gendered communities as such. Two, the critical approach to the clinical view of trauma as an individual pathology opens up the possibility for new lines of inquiry based on the model of trauma as a psychosocial space reproduced by discursive and non-discursive conditions that facilitate the racist and heterosexist distribution of capital. Three, the clinical approach to PTSD is an individual pathology marked by the failure to process an overwhelming experience of violence may be counterproductive. The therapeutic value of hip hop indicates that a focus on the oppressive hierarchical systems of power that inflict and reinforce patterns of traumatic violence is helpful in the effort to re-signify past traumas in order to better manage hypervigilance and rage about the present. Fourth, the economy of PTSD is tied to language. This connection between the dominant discourse and the recurrence of PTSD astonishes people far too little. My favorite Freud quote from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and raises new questions about the role that white sensibility plays in the clinical treatment of PTSD, or how a post-racial sensibility of systemic violence affects the effort to facilitate the process of EMDR. In my own clinical experience with EMDR, I found that my familiarity with underground hip hop music facilitated my ability to re-signify traumatic violence in the past as a product of contingent and unnatural social conditions to which no one should be subject. This proved essential to cease my tendency to blame myself or demonize those who had harmed me as a way of understanding what had occurred. These very, very common tendencies often preclude the ability of those who suffer from PTSD to benefit from EMDR. I should also say that my familiarity with underground hip hop music allowed me to call my therapist out on some really like inappropriate, unprofessional, and potentially damaging statements to me that for her were like perfectly innocuous. But again, that's the role that subjugated knowledge, I think, can play against the dominant discourse. This project is motivated by the aim to take hip hop seriously as a source to better understand and treat the symptoms of PTSD. The therapeutic value of underground hip hop is connected to its distinct aesthetic capacity to bear witness to the everyday forms of traumatic anti-Black violence that escape the limits of white sensibility. This also helps explain the political power of underground hip hop to expose and disrupt these limits, and the pathological need of American courts to criminalize Black MCs who testify to being traumatized by the cops and the courts, their streets, and their schools. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so very much, Lisa. I mean, your work is very fascinating. It departs from the conventional clinical academic approach to PTSD as something individualistic, to exploring the social and collective and lived level of trauma, and how this really plays out in hip hop. Aesthetically and even linguistically. I've known several of the songs you mentioned offhand for a very long time. Tupac's That's the Way It Is, Changes, Jay-Z's is a Hard Knock Life. And I've always seen them, of course, as a critique of the construction of race, but never thought about them in this light of PTSD. Yeah, it's very interesting, very, very fascinating. And just to set the ball rolling, I was just thinking in terms of the healing and the therapeutic process for persons who have PTSD, understood in this collective and social sense. Would the healing itself not also be collective, as against the conventional one-to-one or individualistic approach to healing? I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, when I say that the symptoms of PTSD are closely tied to language and the dominant discourse, that's like straight up, right? So my ability to manage those symptoms and feel comfortable largely depend on the community that I'm in, right? And so when I can use Hip Hop Nation language, right? And when I'm around other people who are very familiar and devoted to Hip Hop Nation as a culture, right? And in my book, I talk a lot about how important the iconic phrases in hip hop culture are and how they help you understand that we're not really talking about a genre of music, right? So I am hip hop saved my life, I do it for hip hop, like just 3 phrases, right? That help convey we are talking about an entire culture with a language, a form of dance, a form of visual art, a very distinct type of humor, right? It's a whole culture. So when I'm around people who are also in Hip Hop Nation and devoted to the underground, I mean, I don't feel any hypervigilance. I feel understood and supported and seen, right? It's when I have to code switch in a different professional or clinical environment and I can't make use of Hip Hop Nation language without being seen as inappropriate, to use the favorite word in Canada, right? Like really, like I can't, at least in Nova Scotia, which is different, I know from other places in Canada, you're not allowed to curse. They call it cursing, right? You're not allowed to use any curse word ever, like public, private. You will be shamed. You will be told that you are inappropriate, and there will be immediate consequences. I barely know how to fucking talk without cursing, right? And it's not a small point. It's philosophically critical to Hip Hop Nation. Why do we believe in the moral importance of cursing? So that we have a way to constantly register our horror and our dissatisfaction with the status quo. We can't be calm. We're angry about what's happening every single second, every single fucking second, I should say, right? So to be in a culture where no one curses ever, and cursing is a sign of being like inappropriate, potentially criminal, has me like, I'm almost constantly like on edge here, right? And just sort of like waiting to be triggered, because I can't make use of my language, which allows me to like express myself, right? Like sort of allows me to get, you know, that's what Hip Hop Nation language does. It gives us a tool to better bear witness to the very facts or ideas that are so ruthlessly disarticulated and obfuscated by the dominant discourse and, you know, conventional manners and habits and all around us, right? So in my own clinical experience with my therapist, I was just like, she's a white woman, right? Not Jewish either, right? So it's just a non-Jewish white woman in me. I was constantly calling her out on the most disturbing sentences she would say to me, and not just me, to a ton of her clients, but only because I know hip hop, but I know how to contest that and also call it out, right, as being damaging and that's inappropriate. So, and I have examples of this in the book, right? So one thing she frequently tells, or she used to tell her clients with PTSD, and again, this is just EMDR, so it wasn't talk therapy. She's just like an administrator. Like she just sits there in the room while I do all the work. It's just that even how a therapist contextualizes the process of EMDR can really preclude the ability of the patient or the client to benefit from it, right? So when we first started like our work together, she said, well, I know you're very smart, but emotionally you're an infant. And do you know what I'm saying? And like, she didn't hear that as violent or abusive at all. And so I just stopped everything and made her listen to Angel Hayes' Battle Cry. I don't know if you've heard that song before, which I really, it's like, analyze it for like 10 pages in the book, right? You can't listen to Angel Hayes' Battle Cry and think that anyone who has survived traumatic violence is an emotional infant. It's just like such a weird way to think about people with PTSD, right? In fact, the habits that we have that often get written off as like pathological symptoms have allowed us to survive, right? And get to where we are today. But she never got that, like, and she doesn't suffer from PTSD, right? So part of the problem with the clinical experience of getting treatment from PTSD is that you're often receiving treatment from people who don't have PTSD at all. Everything they know about PTSD comes from the dominant discourse, and they've never listened to traumatic testimonies that are what I would say subjugated, right? That are excluded from the dominant discourse and also like viewed as themselves, right? Naive or inappropriate, or sort of like in America, they're seen as criminal, right? I know I'm like going on above your original question, but it was a really rich question. And I just sort of wanted to say that like, I address it in like all those different ways, right? Like my comfort is only with Hip Hop Nation, honestly, but like a lot of people in hip hop feel that way, right? So I'm Jewish, right? So I'm not like Anglo-Saxon white, but I have dreadlocks. And for a lot of people, that's weird. It's never been weird for anyone in Hip Hop Nation, right? Like they look at me and they're like, okay, she's hip hop. It's just that's just immediately what they think, right? So it is, yeah, I'm babbling now, but I loved your question.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think Excel will come up on the screen to ask a question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa, for this very thought-provoking talk. And I noticed that you used Juice WRLD's et al. PTSD as an example, which is not an underground hip hop track, right? And
well,
so
I would disagree with you there. And you can't say that as a good question at all. The notion of the underground is so thoroughly and totally contested that nobody with any confidence can say that's not underground, right? But if you follow, you just can't. It's such a contested definition. And if you don't know its contested definition, you need to read more books in hip hop studies. So the definition that I use in my book, right? And I think it should remain contested, what we mean by commercial and underground. And I think that's essential to the history of hip hop, that it remain contested. But again, my definition has nothing to do with commercial success or how many people listen to it. Maybe that's what you're thinking about.
No, but
As I
it's-
explained, my notion is the song, the music has to be about more than hip hop, right? Following Dead Prez, it's bigger than hip hop and has to be focused on showing the connection between traumas in the past that have been misrepresented, disarticulated, obfuscated, and hidden, right? And violence, systemic violence in the present. So for sure, that song does that.
Thank you.
And so there's a question from Andrew Pitts. So just a moment, I'll put off my camera to read that out. It's a pretty lengthy one. So it says, here's a question from Andrew Pitts. Just a moment. I'm trying to get to the top. Okay. So thank you for this tremendously important work, Dr. Skitowski. My question is about how forms of transnational collaboration in hip hop, including collaboration among artists across settler states boundaries, sampling across transnational and translinguistic gens, etc., may respond to the traumas caused by mutually reinforcing relationship between settler colonialism and anti-Black racism, for example. I'm a big fan of the First National Electric Music Group, the Halusi, formerly a tribe called Red, and their album features African-American MCs and poets, such as, let me leave the name out, Colombian musician and so on. I wonder whether this kind of transnational collaboration, collaborative work, including the sampling and scratching practices you mentioned, can serve as a collectivizing response to the oppressive division often imposed between Blacks, Indigenous, and other racialized and colonized communities.
I think so. I think that's a great question. Of course, I can't answer it, but I think the question absolutely sort of takes up my work and shows where it could be going, the larger implications. Like, as you know, hip hop is this international phenomenon. And I think the reason why, and it functions the same in every country, meaning it functions as subjugated knowledge. And I think that's because of the distinct aesthetic form common to all hip hop in terms of sampling and scratching. And so in every country, there's hip hop produced by racialized minorities to contest the dominant episteme of that particular country, which is what makes global hip hop so fascinating and unreal, right? Because in each country, right, the words that are being chosen for co-option and resignification are so completely different, right? Because of the languages. But also this gives hip hop its power in terms of a sort of local resistance, right? Because essential to hip hop sort of culture is like know where you're from, right? And being very focused on the conditions that are affecting your actual community. And also like not mouthing off about communities that you don't know anything about. So in accord with like know where you're from, my book really focuses on American hip hop because that has sustained me since the age of 10 and that's what I know the most. But we are seeing sort of transnational collaborations between hip hop artists that I think could, and already that sort of serves, right? Like Hip Hop Nation globally already serves to connect groups of different, marginalized groups in different countries because there are some like basic experiences that we have in common, right? For instance, just being able to expose how the everyday discourse, like all around us, professional, right, exacerbates, triggers the symptoms of PTSD. But I'm excited to see where more transnational collaboration between hip hop artists move. So I can't answer your question. I just really appreciate it a lot. And I hope that more people in academia start getting involved seriously in hip hop studies. I hope academics start listening to it. I hope they stop being so elitist and annoying, especially in philosophy of music. I'm writing about like every genre except hip hop. I hope people who work in philosophy of music realize they can't write about hip hop if they just listen to it for a few months, that it demands a sort of serious study, just like other genres of music. And I can't think about hip hop as music, right? So like, I don't say anything about music as such as a genre. I don't even know where to begin. It just seems to me like hip hop is so distinct in its actual form, what makes it hip hop, and how it can affect our sensibility as people who are conditioned by the dominant discourse, that all my work only refers to hip hop. I have like nothing to say about music in general.
Thank you, Lisa. And we could have time for one or two more questions quickly. Amadine Katala says that if hip hop is viewed as an empowering tool to process trauma, do you think it could also be characterized as a form of post-traumatic growth? Or do you think this would be too individualistic a way to characterize it?
Well, I just think that I think of it as a type of EMDR. And so there's no like end, right, to post-traumatic growth, if that's what you're going to call it. I'm not like a huge fan of that term itself, which I also think is like pretty condescending. It just reminds me a lot of like, emotionally, you're an infant. I think I listen to nothing but hip hop. I listen to no other music ever. And that's because I have PTSD. And I think Elvis will know this as soon as I say it. When I listen to a song like Bigger Than Hip Hop or that song PTSD, it's not like I listen to it once, twice, or 3 times, right? I'm gonna listen to a song like that like well over 300 times, 400, 500 times. And hip hop is so rich in terms of what it helps you think about because of the sampling, that every single time I listen to a track, every single time I get something new out of it, or a new way to understand or process my own experience of violence. And so if that's what you want to call post-traumatic growth, cool. I do think that hip hop for me is the most helpful tool to consistently live with, cope with, process my symptoms, and also like view my symptoms not as symptoms, but as skills and as strategies for navigating the world. And for a type of wisdom, so I guess I prefer the term post-traumatic wisdom over growth. And I do think that underground hip hop, especially that song, right, shows that people who have PTSD have access to a form of wisdom about the world that is lost to other people. I guess I'll just say on a personal note, like in terms of what I'm listening to now, my dad died in July under the most traumatic possible circumstances. And Kanye dropped Donda not too long after my dad died. I have listened to nothing else except Donda since then. There's nothing else that helps me get through the day and process the excessive trauma, especially because Donda was like Kanye wrote for his mother, right, who died. It's sort of like to honor her, but draws in like all kinds of aspects of his life as well, right? And very critical about how the dominant discourse represents Kanye, right? So Kanye's own reflections on his dad and his life in this brilliant album are really helping me cope with this trauma far more than any, like, Donda is helping me cope with my dad's death right now, far more than like going to see a therapist would, right? And in some sense, seeing white therapists is very frustrating for me with PTSD because they repeat so many of these like discursive claims that are just, for me, from the lens of hip hop, so incredibly abusive and counterproductive to feeling empowered, quite honestly, by the symptoms I have, right, that do provide sort of a lens for understanding and navigating the world that other people don't have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. I do not know. I think we have sort of out of time now, but there are some very interesting questions. Jonathan, can we take one more or?
Well, we've got until past, so if we have a very quick question and answer, just 2 or 3 minutes, then that's fine.
Okay. So let's have one more question, and so we have just a moment. Sorry. Now I can't find it. Yeah, we have a question from Ian Grenier. I hope I pronounced the name right. And it says, where is it now? More questions keep coming in, Lisa. So you might receive if
I guess I should
in your email.
not to self-promote, but I should say
Yeah.
that not the new project I was just talking about, the critical aesthetics, but everything else I was talking about, just establishing this parallel between hip hop and PTSD, that's all in the book.
In the book,
You
okay.
guys can go read that or get your university to buy it.
Okay.
It dropped in December 2020, and George Yancey is the editor.
Okay, so Jan says, as you mentioned, subjugated group and subjugated knowledge. Okay, as you mentioned, subjugated group and subjugated knowledge, but also the political resistance and horizon expressed in Dead Prez. Do you feel that hip hop allows for the emergence of subject groups as political responses to both conditions of domination and PTSD?
I just don't understand what the question means. The creation of subject groups. I don't know what that means.
So if you perhaps Ian, you could
I think that
yeah.
this is Shelley.
Okay.
Hi, Lisa. I think that by subject groups, Jan means like what would be called identity groups.
So
Like social groups formulated around particular identities.
sure. I mean, we have that within hip hop, right? There are subgenres. And so there are people who identify as trap, right? And there are people who identify as old school. And now there are people who identify with like SoundCloud rappers, right? So identity positions are formed in terms of allegiances within hip hop. And then we often will refer to ourselves like certain people in terms of words that are developed within hip hop nation language that other people might find offensive. So for instance, when I'm just talking to my friends and I'm not in a professional environment, I refer to myself and all women almost exclusively as bitches, which I understand sounds offensive to people who are not in hip hop nation language. But I'm very comfortable with it. So can it create new forms of like new ways to identify ourselves and how we identify others and ourselves in relation to others? Yeah, absolutely. Because it's also co-option, right? So like hip hop is constantly co-opting terms in the dominant discourse and re-signifying it to be a positive signification, right? And this is what we've seen with the term bitch, right? Which is like, I guess, a negative term, right? But that word always signifies an outspoken, strong woman who doesn't really put up with any bullshit, right? So yes, absolutely call me a bitch, right? And so it's an example of how we co-opt terms that are meant to be negative and meant to denigrate minority groups into a positive term that actually really empowers us. So that happens all the time.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you all for your questions. So sorry for those whose questions are open and not answered. Hopefully you could find answers in Lisa's book, which obviously I'll be looking forward to read.
Thank you so much, Elvis. That was so sweet. You were so kind.
It's been a very excellent talk, really. And look forward to more research and more papers coming from you with regards to hip hop and trauma as well. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. Such a really thought-provoking session, and so many connections with other things in the conference. And in fact, so many things in many people's lives as well. So Lisa and Elvis, thank you so much for that session.